Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Marley and today we are going to talk a bit about how I achieve realistic fur with graphite pencil. So this will be a breakdown also of my layering process, which is very similar across the board for most subject matter. So it can go either way. You can see this as a bit of a talk on my layering process, but also how I build up layers to achieve fur. In this case, the specific texture of fur. So before I start anything, I always put down a wash of graphite powder. This is generally with a synthetic brush, just to give myself a soft layer of just a grey wash to start working off of. I prefer doing this as I don't like working off of the white paper from the get-go. I prefer doing that when I'm building up the inside structure. So for the line work, I do very basic outlines, and then with the powder on a brush or on a paper stump, I will fill in the structure itself. That would be any kind of defining muscle structure or bone structure, anything that defines the actual shape of what I'm drawing. So this is a continuous step. It generally depends on what you're drawing and the type of artist that you are, how long this will take. So I generally do it very quickly, basic shapes, basic outlines where my major shadows are, and then from there I'll go in with either a layer of pencil or go in straight with my mono erasers to just define the shape even more. So the pencils I will start out using will be my lower range ends of the spectrum. So these pencils will generally be your 2H to your HB. I like using the F pencil as these kind of starting steps of building the structure and the layer. So for fur in particular, I tend to build the texture from the first layer up. But these initial layers of texture are more to build the depth in the fur itself. It's not the final detail layer. It's not supposed to look like fur from the get-go, but it's supposed to give you that depth. So once you've added that final layer of highlights and shadows, it will kind of look like the fur has depth to it, which we all know fur is not just one layer. Depending on, say for instance, you're drawing a clipped horse, it will generally be just one layer of fur. But for the lions in this case, you know it's got depth. It's got to show layers and layers and layers of fur texture. So I like to build that up from the get-go, from those initial layers, but very slowly. And it's kind of more of a broader sense, and then you narrow it down as you continue with the layers. So the fur is a very specific way of showing my layering process, and it's kind of the bare bones of my layering process. It's the first thing that I learned to do with graphite, as I was very obsessed with drawing horses, and horses are basically fur with all the other add-ons. So my layering process stems from being able to draw fur. So layering is just a mixture of pencils and powders that you constantly remove and add. So it's constantly a removal of powder, it's constantly addition of pencils or powders, and that removal comes from the mono eraser, which also helps to build the texture of what you're drawing. So the mono erasers to me is not just a way of adding highlights, but I use it somewhat in a way that you would a pencil. It's just kind of the reverse of the pencil. It's very useful to create that depth in fur texture, create those little light strands in between your darker sections of fur. So I briefly mentioned that I like to build the texture up with layering. But when it comes to layering in general and fur as well, the details to me is the final steps. It's not something that I add from the get-go. I always mention depth, and you can't really create the depth if you're always focusing on the details. So you have to strip away the drawing tool to kind of its base, its foundation values, and build those values up first. That is very much the way you would blend for fur. So you've got to think in a way that you're building up the animal from its bones up. So it's the bone structure that goes in first, that defines the animal. And then it's the muscle structure that further defines the animal. Then you need to add the values that helps define that even further. So thinking you're putting in the skin of the animal, and then on top of that, only do you start adding fur texture. And that is very much the way I break down any form of drawing. not just fur in general. So it's breaking it down into its base values. What values really help these details stand out and actually create that depth that you need to make this a realistic drawing. So that's the basic gist of the layering process with fur. I briefly touched on the pencils I would use in the beginning. So the beginning layers are very much the lower end of the spectrum, 2H to HB. From there, I start layering it up and building up the values. I like to start from my shadows first. Those are generally the first shapes or values that I tend to put in, and then I build up the lighter areas from there. And that's generally a mixture of these pencils layered on top of one another with powder. And then I'll slowly start going up in my range to 3Bs, then start getting added your 2Bs, your 3Bs, layer those. If you can, I would generally say don't just use your powders to blend or your blending stumps to blend. Try playing around with your pencils and use them to blend each other. So the pencils that I use, the Cretacolors and the Staedtler Lumographs, not so much the Faber-Castells. Those two pencils, if you blend an F over a B pencil, any range in the B pencil, it will blend it out and actually fill in the gaps and make it slightly darker than it was before. So being able to blend your pencils on top of one another will create. So that's kind of my little trick for also blending and layering pencils and creating those unique values that you need for realism, specifically in graphite pencil. So fur is very much, it's not just, you can't just use your set of graphite pencils to create fur. Yes, you obviously can, but you won't really get that realistic feel in depth. You need to be able to put your pencils on top of one another and be able to create unique values from those sets of pencils. So the two brands that I use blend beautifully on top of one another, the pencils. So the H pencils will really add a different dimension to the B pencils if you layer on top of them. And then subsequently adding powder would just soften that up and also create an extra little addition to the value already. So I use powders not generally to create also a wash and a softness, but it also to help blend between the pencils. So fur specifically is not a very harsh texture. Yes, you get coarser fur and you get silkier fur and curly fur and wet fur, but generally fur is a smooth gradation in your values. So you need to be able to first, with those initial layers, before you add those final details on top, is create a smooth transitions between your values. And to create those smooth transitions, you really do need those unique values in between. And that is where my slow layering process really comes into play, because I build each layer step for step and very slowly build up the values. I get those unique differences between the layers and between the values themselves. And that in turn will also create your depth on which your details will then go on top of. So the detail layers is very much, don't think of it as just your final depths of your darkest pencils or your lightest highlights. I generally, for fur, if I get to those final stages, I will go straight back to a 2H to create those finer little detailed lines that really define the fur. And then on top of that, add the same, but very sporadically. It's not supposed to be a pattern of creating fur. It's supposed to be unique and random. So in the initial stages, it won't look as random. It's very much just little lines that you create. In those final detail layers, once you use, say for instance, I'll use a 2H and a 9B and the mono eraser. It will be very specific places where I put those pencils to create that unique fur texture. So fur, if you look at it, it's got places where you can see more definition than others. You can add a little wispy strand here and there that creates a little bit of interest and also defines the texture. So that is for the final layers. And you can think of these beginning layers, middle layers, and final layers as kind of a continuous in-between step. So as you move in from your beginning values to your mid values, you kind of, there's a moment in between where you kind of switch in between those two pencils, where you then use the full range. And then when you get to the final layers, you now use your full range of pencils, and you can go from your lightest to your darkest in that final layer. And that you still want to be able, with the softness that you've added your layers with, you should still be able to see the differences that even a 2H will make in the final stages. So for these lines in particular, I blended and layered up until about 50-60%. It's not complete. So for most of my drawings, I like to get the entire drawing up to that 60%, 70% completion stage, where I know my mid values are now in. I've created every single space of the drawing has been filled in, and I've got everything to a point where I'm very satisfied with its placement, the size of it, and also kind of the depth up until the last layers. So for these lines, I got it to up in that point, and you can also see the textures already quite visible. So around that 60% completion point, you want to be able to have that texture kind of at a nice place where you can see whether or not you've actually achieving what you want, or you need to maybe add another layer of powder over top and blend a bit more. So the reason I do this is just to check my values. I very much don't like to complete an area before moving on to another section, because I like to use the sections of drawings to check my values, to see whether or not it makes sense to have that form of depth in this subject matter in relation to anything else in the drawing. So the lines in particular, if you've been following along with the Draw With Me's or just seeing the progress over on my other socials, you would notice that the foliage is a very, very big part of the drawing. So the fur you can get correct, but if the values does not make sense within which it is placed, and this is for anything else that you draw that's not just a standalone portrait. So if this was a portrait you're doing for someone of their dog or their horse, it's a standalone thing, and it really doesn't matter what it looks like in relation to something else. So I use that layering process to kind of check my values as I go along, as I don't want one place to be darker or lighter than it needs to be, so that it doesn't interfere with the depth of the drawing. So I don't want the foliage to be too light or too dark, or the lines to be too dark and very contrasted in relation to the foliage. So I just want that good balance. So that is the short and sweet of my layering process. I really do hope that makes sense, as I kind of do waver sometimes at some points and lose my train of thought, but I hope that makes sense and explains my layering process and the reason why I do things the way I do. So I like to take the slow approach. You obviously can play around with your pencils and find the right fit for you in your layering process. But I really like to emphasize the importance of taking your time to build up those first layers to really get that depth, so that your texture has substance and that real depth of contrast, and it not just some highlights and shadows thrown in between. And that's very important for fur in general, to get that soft building of layers and depth with that texture on top. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you for the next one. Happy drawing, everyone.